New year, new book. Well, not a new book. It's still in the Bible, but if you've been tracking me for a while now, back in September of 2024, I started doing a series called The God Story, and I didn't realize how long it was going to take me. We're still in it. So we've been doing this series now for like almost a year and a half. And what it is I'm tracking through all the themes of the Bible. I started in Genesis, went through the entire Old Testament. We started on the biographies of Jesus, the Gospels, this last spring, went through that, walked through Acts this last fall. And now we're going to be hitting the rest of the New Testament. And my staff asked me, how long is this going to take you, to do the rest of the New Testament? And I was like, I don't know. It might be the whole year. But I'm trying not to, if you've been tracking with me, I'm trying not to go through every single verse or every single chapter of the Bible, but I'm hitting all of the major themes. And so once you get out of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the next book of the Bible is the book of Acts, which we've went through. And then you hit letters that the early disciples wrote to churches all over the known world at that time. A lot of them were written by Paul. And so the first book that you hit after the book of Acts is the book of Romans. And Romans is probably the longest letter that the Apostle Paul wrote to a church. It's called Romans because it was written to the churches in Rome. And it's probably one of also the most theologically dense letters that he wrote. And so we're going to be tackling that over the next few weeks, hitting some of the major themes. Paul wrote this while he was doing his missionary journeys. So if you know the story of Paul, he did what we know of is 3 different missionary journeys. And we think that he wrote the book of Romans or the letter to the Roman church on his 3rd missionary journey. And they think that he was probably writing it from the city of Corinth in about AD 57. So if you know the story of Jesus, they figure probably was crucified, died, and rose from the grave around AD 33. Paul would have come to faith maybe a year or 2 after that. And he started doing these missionary journeys. So he wrote this probably, a couple decades after the death and resurrection of Jesus. He had an intention of traveling to Spain. From Paul's perspective, he didn't know of anybody that went to Spain. And Paul, in his ministry, he always wanted to go somewhere where nobody else had gone. So when he looked at different cities, he's like, okay, there's already churches there. Where can I go where there isn't a church, where people need to hear the good news of Jesus? So he wanted to go to Spain. And he was planning on passing through Rome on the way. And he wanted to visit the churches in Rome. There was churches in Rome. What I mean by churches is not like this. They were home churches. They met in people's houses. And there's probably they figure that when we look at the end of the book of Romans, we can gather, they figure maybe there was about 5 different house churches going on. Maybe they guess 100 to 200 people total that he's writing to at that time. And so when you walk through the book of Romans, it's the most normal thing. We always want to start at the beginning, don't we? It's like if you're a new Christian, you hand a Christian a Bible, the most natural thing they want to do is start in Genesis. Typically, I tell new Christians, it's probably not a good idea. It's good to start with the life of Jesus. That seems so counterintuitive. But the Bible's made up of many letters and many books squished together in one volume. Now, the book of Romans is interesting in the fact that we can gather a greater sense of why Paul wrote to the book to the church in Rome by actually starting at the end. So I'm actually going to be starting at the end today. But some of the context of this is interesting that you need to know. Most of these churches, like the church in Rome, probably started off almost all Jewish, if not completely Jewish. And the church would have started out like that. But something happened in AD 49 that's really, really interesting. Something happened in Rome that made Emperor Claudius want to kick out all of the Jews from Rome. And there is this Roman historian, his name is Suetonius, and he wrote about this action that the Emperor Claudius did where he kicked out all of the Jews from Rome. And he said it was over strife over a guy named Chrestus, which is really interesting. Most historians think that he got the name wrong. It's not Chrestus, that it was actually Christus, which is Latin for Christ. There was some issue going on in Rome where there was strife in the Jewish community over a guy named Christ. Does that sound familiar? And Claudius was so fed up with it that he just kicked them all out of the city. Now, eventually Claudius dies, and there's a new emperor on the scene. His name is Nero. You guys probably heard of him. Not a popular guy. But he's on the scene, and he allows the Jewish people to slowly filter back in. So what you have is you have these Jewish people who have been expelled out of the city. They're now filtering back into Rome. And now the church has been growing over time, and it's been mainly the people who have stayed in Rome, and how the church has grown has been mainly Gentile or non-Jewish people. So now you have a church that's mainly Gentile. You have Jewish Christians and Jewish people that are slowly filtering back in the city, and now there's issues at play. And we think that part of the reason why Paul wrote the book of Romans is because he's addressing those issues that are going on in the church with these two different ethnic groups that are trying to get along. And that's the setting to this. Now, if you want to know a little bit about the setting to this, you go right to the end of the book of Romans and you read Romans 16. And this is the chapter that we usually skip past because Paul's just like naming people. And we're like, I don't know. We're like, who is these people? I don't know. Just skip past it. But it's actually really, really important. So in Romans 16, he says this: I commend to you our sister Phoebe. Now that's like very like official language, but when he says, I commend to you my sister Phoebe, he's saying, there's this woman named Phoebe I'm sending to you. She's a good person. I want you to take care of her. She is a deacon, it says, who is a deacon in the church in Centuria. Welcome her in the Lord as one who is worthy of honor among God's people. Help her in whatever she needs, for she has been helpful, or she has been a patron to many, and especially to me. Why am I reading this to you? I'm reading this to you is because most likely Phoebe is actually the one who is the letter carrier to the church in Rome. They wouldn't have had like regular, Canada Mail or whatever service. And so Paul has written this letter in Corinth. Centuria is a little city right next to Corinth. And he needs to get this letter there. And he picks this woman named Phoebe. She is the letter carrier. So she travels all the way to Rome with this letter. And being a letter carrier isn't just like our letter carriers today where they show up on your door, they put the letter in the mailbox, and they take off. And you have no idea who the letter carriers are. The letter carriers were incredibly important people. And this is the reason why. Phoebe's not just bringing the letter to the church in Rome. She's there to read the letter to the churches in Rome. So she's going from house church to house church. And she's not just like giving a letter and then taking off. She's going there and she's reading it to them. Not just reading it to them, but she would have spent time with Paul to fully understand this letter. She knows the ins and outs of it. In fact, historians think that potentially the letter carrier would have memorized the letter. And she would have gone and not just stood up in front of the crowd and read out a letter like this, but she would have known the emotion behind it. And she would have presented it in a way that Paul would have wanted her to present it. He's like, this is the feeling behind this. This is the point of what I'm saying. And not just that, but the letter carrier is there to actually answer questions as well, to the million questions they would have had reading through the letter to Rome, because it's a big, thick letter. And so it would have been very interactive. She would have been reading it, and people would have been like, hey, what about this? What about that? Phoebe would have been the one who would have been trained by Paul to actually answer their questions. And I'm telling you all this to get a sense of what it would have been like to be in the Church of Rome. You're in a small house church. Maybe there's 20 people, 30, 40 people that's there. Phoebe shows up. And now the time has come for her to present this letter to them. It says here that she's a deacon in the church, which would have been a leadership position. It means servant. Deacons were appointed by the early church to help, to serve, to be a part of the leadership. She's a minister of the Word of God. It says that she is, in the New Living Translation, it says she has been helpful to many. The most direct translation is that she has been a patron. A patron is somebody in the ancient world that would have had financial means. Oftentimes, a patron would have had maybe a bigger house. They would have opened up their house for churches to meet in. And a patron is someone who would have had financial means that supports the work of the ministry. So Phoebe maybe have been a woman with money that would have been using her finances to finance this project in and of itself. So Paul is writing to these church leaders. If you continue in Romans 16, he names all sorts of people. And we figure that these are probably house church leaders. They're Jewish people. They're Gentile people. They are even slaves that are mentioned in this. It's mixed up. So you're talking about different ethnicities, different financial situations, and these are leaders in the church in Rome. Now, I want to take you guys to Romans chapter 14. I believe that Romans chapter 14 is actually, now this is my opinion, I just want to make it clear. I believe that Romans 14 is actually the setting and the context of the main motivation, other than the fact that he's passing through Rome to go to Spain, the main motivation of why he's writing this letter to the church in Rome. It says this in Romans 14. Sorry, we're jumping in the middle of his letter. He says this, accept other believers who are weak in faith and don't argue with them about what they think is right or wrong. For instance, one person believes it's all right to eat anything, but another believer with a sensitive conscience will eat only vegetables. Those who feel free to eat anything must not look down on those who don't. And those who don't eat certain foods must not condemn those who do, for God has accepted them. Who are you to condemn someone else's servants? Their own master will judge whether they stand or fall. And with the Lord's help, they will stand and receive his approval. Paul's writing this letter, and if you walk through the letters of the New Testament, one of the biggest controversies in the early church dealing with Jewish people and non-Jewish people was in regards to food and special holy days. And in this letter, he refers to the different sides of the factions as those who are weak and those who are strong. So what is going on here? The early church, as you know, because Jesus was a Jew, was made up of Jewish people. And there were three specific things that Jewish people really, really emphasized when it came to Torah observance. Now, what I mean by the Torah is that when you open up your Old Testament, the first 5 books of the Old Testament are Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Those are the first 5 books of the Bible. The Torah, when you translate directly into English, we oftentimes translate it in our Bibles as the law. But another really, really great way to translate the word Torah is actually instruction. The Old Testament, the first 5 books specifically, there's all sorts of instruction in Leviticus and Numbers and Deuteronomy, instructions for the nation of Israel. And there were 3 main things that these Jewish Christians were so used to doing and represented their faith, and it was these 3 things. 1, eating kosher. 2, observing Sabbath. 3, circumcision. And you see this talked about in the New Testament because for Jewish people, this was incredibly important. When it comes to eating kosher, food laws had to do with them eating what God had told the nation of Israel. These are clean animals. Now, clean animals were very, very specific in the Old Testament in regards to animals that chewed cud and had a split hoof. I'm getting really complicated here. But typically it included not eating pork, not eating things like shrimp and crab, not eating rabbit, things like that. There's very specific animals that they were allowed and not allowed to eat. And these food laws, part of it was, now having different food laws in the ancient world was actually pretty normal. But for the Jewish people in the ancient world, it separated them and it caused them to be different from the nations surrounding them. God gave them specific laws and rules to separate them and make them different. And food laws were very, very important. Now, by the time Paul is writing this letter, there's something else going on. So you have different animals that they're not supposed to eat. They're supposed to be killed in a certain way. But something's going on in the Roman Empire that's really, really important as well. And it's this. In the ancient world, when they would go to the grocery store or the market, all the animals that were slaughtered were actually first killed in the pagan temples, in the ancient temples, and they were sacrificed to the gods. So they were first sacrificed to the gods, and then they would take the meat and they would sell it in the marketplace. So there's this real kind of controversy in the early church in regards to this, where you're like, should we be eating this meat? This meat isn't just, Farmer Joe killing his cow, butchering it, hanging it, doing all that thing, and selling in the market. It is people that are killing animals, and they're sacrificing them to Zeus and Apollo and Aphrodite and all the different gods in the temple. And then they're selling it, and they're like, is that food okay for us to eat? Because it's been sacrificed to these gods that we don't believe in. Not just that, but they're not kosher either. So this was really, really important. Once we get to the book of Acts in the New Testament, God's net of salvation isn't just with the Jews, it's for the whole world. God separates and he calls the nation of Israel to be a light unto the nations. But with Jesus' death and resurrection, there's a brand new covenant. There's a brand new way of living. And this old covenant or Torah has been fulfilled in Jesus. And it's not necessary anymore for these Christians or these new believers to necessarily follow these Old Testament laws anymore. A new day has dawned and things have changed. The old covenant or the old laws are not thrown away necessarily. In fact, many of the principles in the old covenant are very useful from a perspective of showing us biblical principles, even if they're not followed to the letter of the law. And so you have this issue in the early church where they're really struggling with, what do we follow anymore? Are we supposed to follow the Old Testament instruction? Are we supposed to not follow it? What is happening in this situation? And there's a controversy with that. And in this scripture, Paul is referring to those who feel like they have to follow the Old Testament law as those who are weak. And he refers to those who are not following the Old Testament law anymore, don't think it's necessary, as those who are strong. Those who are weak, who are probably mainly Jewish Christians, are struggling with this. And they're looking down on the Gentile Christians. And they're saying, you got to be doing this. If you are a good Christian, if you're a good follower of Jesus, you need to be following these Old Testament laws. Those who are the strong are those who feel like, I have been given freedom in Jesus and those Old Testament laws don't pertain to me anymore, and I have freedom from this. I don't have to do this anymore. But they're also looking down upon their Jewish brothers and sisters and seeing them as something lesser than. They are the ones who are in the wrong. They're the ones who need to learn. They're the ones who need to change. It's interesting because Paul, he actually technically sides with those who would be the strong. He doesn't follow, even though he's a Jew, he doesn't follow the Old Testament laws in that way anymore. But in this letter, Paul actually doesn't take sides. He doesn't take sides. In fact, he encourages them not to judge one another. He says, who are you to judge your brother or your sister in Jesus? They're going to stand before God one day, and they have to do what they feel is right in their conscience. Who are you to judge? So in verse 5, I'm going to dive into the next one. He says, in the same way, some think one day is more holy than another, while others think every day is alike. You should each be fully convinced that whichever day you choose is acceptable. I think he's diving into Sabbath observance here. Because for Jewish people, observing Sabbath was really, really important. So Sabbath was not working at all from Friday sundown to Saturday sundown. And this is something that they had observed for thousands of years from the time that they'd been taken out of slavery in Egypt. And Paul is like, you know what, you guys are going to follow different days. Now, in the early church, there's something called the Lord's Day that pops up. And the Lord's Day, we believe, is them when they started worshiping, the early church started worshiping on Sunday because that is the day that Jesus rose from the grave. And so you have these early Gentile Christians who are worshiping on Sunday. You have the Jewish people who are worshiping on Saturday. That one day is right, the other day is right. And Paul's like, who cares? Who cares? One day is not more important than the other. Paul's like, the point is, pick a day. Pick a day and worship. Be fully convinced in your own mind what is acceptable and do it. But don't judge other people who have a different opinion than you and worship on a different day. It just doesn't matter. So you have food laws, you have Sabbath observance. Chapter 14, verse 13, I'm going to skip to there. This is what Paul says. He says, so let's stop condemning each other. Decide instead to live in such a way that will not cause another believer to stumble and fall. I know and am convinced on the authority of the Lord Jesus that no food in and of itself is wrong to eat. But if someone believes it is wrong, then for that person it is wrong. And if another person is distressed by what you eat, you are not acting in love if you eat it. Don't let your eating ruin someone to whom Christ died. Then you will not be criticized for doing something you believe is good. I love this. This is so important. Honestly, we're here on the first Sunday of the year. We're going to be diving into this just a little bit more before we're finished here. But Paul is like, at the end of the day, all food is clean. But if someone sees that as incredibly important, you need to care about them more than you care about your freedom to eat whatever the heck you want to eat. In fact, he says, don't cause someone to stumble and fall. Paul is actually constantly referencing the Old Testament. This idea of stumbling and falling is an Old Testament reference mentioned many times. We're going to take you guys to Leviticus 19:14. This is part of the Torah, the Old Testament law, and it says this: "You shall not curse the deaf or put a stumbling block before the blind, but you shall fear your God." This is a very literal command. You're going to have deaf people in your midst. Don't curse them. Don't say stuff behind their back that they can't hear. Respect them. You're going to have blind people in your community. Make sure you remove stuff out of their way as this blind person's walking down the road, that they don't stumble on it and fall. Take care of your blind neighbor. Take care of them. So it's very literal, but it's very metaphorical as well. Paul is saying, hey, you have freedom to worship on whatever day you want to worship. You have freedom to eat whatever food you want to eat. But loving your brother or sister in Christ, or loving your neighbor, is more important than you doing what you feel you have the freedom to do. So if your neighbor, that thing of like eating that meat that originally was sacrificed in the temple is now being sold in the market, you don't have an issue with it. But if that causes him to have an issue in his faith, it's going to cause him to stumble in his faith, then don't do it. Just don't do it. Yeah, the meat tastes good, and you have the freedom to do it, but I want you to care more about your neighbor than your freedom to do whatever you want to do. And then in verse 19, he says, "So then, let us aim for harmony in the church and try to build each other up." Paul is looking at the big picture. This is the big picture. This is the big picture. He's saying, man, the most important thing is harmony in the church. You guys are going to have different opinions about what you think is important. Put your opinions aside, because they're not nearly as important as you heading in the same direction, having unity, having harmony within the body of Christ, and building one another up. Now, as we read this, it's really, really easy to just like zoom out and be like, this has nothing to do with me because I don't have an issue with eating kosher. The whole like Sabbath day thing's not a big deal. That's not an issue for us. But this is really, really applicable. This is really applicable. We actually deal with this type of thing in the church all the time. Like all the time. I mean, I went through just a few different things. If you want to talk about theological discussions or what we believe as a church, you know, some of the things that people can get really hung up on are end times. How do you interpret the book of Revelation or any other book in the Bible? And we can get really hung up on our interpretation, and that can create division in the church. Just not important. Spiritual gifts. We are a church that believes in spiritual gifts. We believe in prophecy. We believe that God heals people. And you know what? There's different opinions about how spiritual gifts should be like practiced in the church. That shouldn't cause division. Like you can have your opinion, another person can have another opinion, but at the end of the day, it's the gospel of Jesus Christ that is the most important. Baptism, communion, churches do baptism differently. Churches do communion differently. Churches worship differently. How we do music a certain way. This isn't necessarily the right way. That's just the way we do it. We can get upset about that. We can get upset about what kind of songs that are sung, whether it's hymns or not, or whatever it is. People get upset about that. How about I dive into stuff that's even more controversial with you guys? Know what broke my heart? And I know some of you guys aren't going to want me to bring this up because it's still sensitive. You know what broke my heart was COVID. People were like, get vaccinated. There was other people who were like, don't get vaccinated. And that split the church. People were so strong on their opinion about whether or not they should be vaccinated or not that like people left churches and broke up families. It's like, who cares? If you want to get vaccinated, get vaccinated. If you don't, don't. But why is that splitting us? Masks? I couldn't believe how divisive that was about wearing a mask, not wearing a mask. Like, who cares? Love your brother. Love your brother. Love your sister. Don't let stuff like that bring division into the church. If Paul was here, imagine what Paul would say about this stuff. He would say, do not let that. Drinking alcohol. You know what? There are people in the church that are very, very strong that you should not drink alcohol. And you know what? I'll guarantee you there are people in the church that are like, I'm totally fine with that. That shouldn't be something that splits. If you have a conviction of that, you need to follow that conviction. But don't judge someone else on that because they are going to stand before God, not you. Not you. What else? Entertainment choices. What movies to watch, what TV shows to watch, what books to read, whatever it is. There can be all sorts of like opinions on that. Have your opinion. Don't judge your brother and sister on that. They're going to stand before God. They're going to stand before God. You know another one that's like really divisive? Save the like best for last here. Political parties. Political parties. It's like whatever political party you support or politician you support, how divisive that is. That sense that like if you are a good Christian, you should fill in the blank. Vote for this, support this, whatever. You know what? There's going to be so many different opinions in the church about politics, who you vote for, what you support, whatever. That shouldn't be a deciding factor either. So Paul was dealing with food issues, Sabbath issues, whatever. That was divisive. And he was like, I don't care which side you stand on. Have your opinion. That's ultimately not the most important thing. But if it's going to cause someone else to stumble, then just don't do it. Because your love for your brother and sister is more important than your opinion. So if I can say this, and this is going to come up on the screen here, our opinions become problematic when fellowship is broken, humility is lost, and love is eclipsed by being correct. I have my opinions. My family would say I'm opinionated. But man, I never want my opinions to be problematic in this way where it breaks fellowship with any of you guys. And we need to be humble, right? In the sense that like I have my opinions, but I can be wrong. This is my opinion on this. But I got like the commentary in the back here. Humility, like let's be humble in recognizing that we have our opinions, but we can be wrong. One day I think it's going to be humorous. Think about this. One day you're going to get to heaven, you're going to stand before Jesus, and you're going to realize all the things you were wrong about. That's going to be entertaining. Even you, Aaron, even you. You're going to realize it's going to be like, oh, man, I was so wrong about that stuff. That's okay. Right? Our love is eclipsed by trying to be too correct. You know what? Paul doesn't say that truth doesn't matter. It 100% matters. But love governs how truth is handled. Love always needs to be governed by how truth is handled. Unity is preserved through humility. And the church, we always need to major on the gospel. What is the message of Jesus? So sometimes people feel like, Matt, you need to talk about this, you need to talk about that, whatever. And sometimes I'm careful. The reason why I'm careful about what I talk about from the pulpit is because I never want those opinions and those things to ever eclipse the saving message of Jesus. We can never get that wrong. The saving message of Jesus is what it's all about. One day we're going to get to heaven and we're going to be shocked at who's there. Right? Man, because we judge, right? I never would have guessed that guy would have got to heaven. We're going to be shocked. Jesus' grace, God's grace for us is greater. It's greater than all of our sin. It's greater than all of our opinions. And that was the heart of Paul. And when you jump to the beginning of Romans, Paul is going to dive into this aspect of salvation. And he goes into chapters and chapters about what salvation looks like for the Jew as well as the Gentile. And that's the core. That is the core of what we believe. And that is what we're going to focus on in this church. And that is what I pray moving forward from this Sunday to the rest of 2026, that nothing would be lost other than we would never lose the message of Jesus. All of the rest can be somewhat debatable.